Dear Greek Consul General, Honorable Christina Valassopoulou, dear guests, it is my honor to welcome you to the opening 2024 event for the Department of Classics and Archaeology, the Learning Community Series, made possible through the Engaged Learning Fund awarded by the Dean's Office of the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts. Today's event is co-sponsored with the Department of Political Science and International Relations and the Peace and Justice Program. Let me introduce our distinguished guest. Dr. Elizabeth Davis is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Director of Graduate Studies at Princeton University. Her research and writing, grounded in the European horizons and the Ottoman history of the Greek-speaking world, focus on the intersections of psyche, body, history, and power. Her particular interest is in how the ties that bind people to communities and states are yielded and inflected by knowledge. That is, how expert and subaltern epistemologies mediate conceptions of self and others. Her first book, Bad Souls, Madness and Responsibility in Modern Greece, 2012, is an ethnographic study of responsibility among psychiatric patients and their caregivers in the multicultural borderland between Greece and Turkey. She has also written 2 books based on long-term ethnographic and archival research in Cyprus that she will talk to you about today, a research that started in 2012 or even earlier. The first book is the one that we are here to discuss and she will be presenting on. It's called Artifactual, Forensic and Documentary Knowing, and it addresses public secrecy and knowledge projects about the violence of the 1960s, 70s that led to the enduring division of Cyprus, including forensic investigations of the missing, visual archives, and documentary film. The second, The Time of the Cannibals, on conspiracy theory and context, she just submitted to the press in early January, takes Cyprus as a context for rethinking conspiracy theory and political theology. Beyond these projects, Davis has written on economic crisis and suicide in Greece and is currently studying orthodox and heterodox death rituals and burial practices in monastic and worldly context of austerity. She's also working on a documentary film addressing the public life of sacred bones in Cyprus. Let me also acknowledge my students, our students, and my co-panelists. I'm Katerina Zakaria, and I'm Professor of Classics and Chair of Classics and Archaeology at LMU. The students for my Interdisciplinary Connections course on representations of Greece Ancient and Modern attend this class and have an embedded LA Greek Film Festival internship. I created this course following the misrepresentations of contemporary affairs in Greece during the devastating financial crisis of 2008 to 18. And set out to explore how stereotypes in media are linked to contextual negotiations of identity, capitalize on work on Greek ethnic identity formation and cultural politics, and introducing students to the cultural theories of Stuart Hall, Edward Said, Michel Foucault, and others. Students select their research topics for the course from the Los Angeles Greek Film Festival submissions, our 10-year-long community partner, and publish a blog on their selected films and interviews. So many hope to interview the Greek Consul General and other guests here today. Dr. Chris Jackson is an instructor of political science and international relations. He earned a PhD in political science from Georgia State University in 2022. His research and teaching focuses on conflict management, state building, negotiations and mediation, and more specifically on questions of how subnational groups interact with international organizations. He also serves as managing editor of Global Studies Quarterly. Now, a few logistics. Professor Davis will present for about 30 minutes. Her presentation will be followed by a Q&A, where we will sit up with microphones, but we will also have microphones for the students. And so please have your questions ready. The event, as you see, is being recorded, and at the end of the recording, we'll put it up on the Classics and Archaeology YouTube, and it's going to be available to students in my classes so that we don't have it for general distribution. So it's my pleasure to welcome our esteemed speaker, Dr. Lisa Davis.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Katarina so much for organizing this event with such thoughtfulness and resourcefulness and enthusiasm. I'm grateful to her and to Chris for reading. I'm really looking forward to our conversation in general. Thanks to everyone in the audience for your interest. I'm honored and excited to be here with you. I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow, and just so you know, there are about 50 images here, and they're going to loop as I'm speaking, so have a look as you like. So I'm going to talk a bit about the book itself, Artifactual, and what I was trying to accomplish with this project. The book itself is actually part of the work that I've been doing in Cyprus over the last 15 years or so, and I'll talk a little bit later maybe in the discussion about the thinking I've been doing about conspiracy theory, about sacred bodies and body parts, political theology, the relations between politics and religion. To me, this is all part of the same project, but right now the remarks that I've prepared are just a sort of overview or an introduction to the book that I hope will raise some interesting questions for us to discuss. So in some respects, this book addresses what's known as the Cyprus problem, I'll say capital T. And I should acknowledge at the outset that any approach to the Cyprus problem, mine included, is bound to be fraught and complicated. Now, some of you may know intimately the history of conflict in Cyprus. Others may not know a thing about it. It's too easy to say that the historical facts are contested, though they certainly are. And I've found it impossible to choose a starting point from which to narrate the historical events in question. I would certainly not choose to start where so many histories of the conflict do, with the attempted coup in July 1974, when right-wing extremist Greek Cypriots, backed by the junta in Greece, provoked the invasion of the island by Turkish military forces. The war that ensued caused mass casualties and massive displacement, as Greek Cypriots evacuated to the south of the island and Turkish Cypriots to the north, and other Cypriots found themselves having to choose one side or the other, or to leave the island altogether. The war put an end to civil, paramilitary, and state violence that had been going on for more than 2 decades by then, but it also led to the indefinite occupation of the north by the Turkish military forces. The de facto ceasefire line between north and south was enforced until 2003 by an impassable border, and since 2003 by the discretion of checkpoint police and soldiers, armed police and soldiers. I understand the attempted coup in 1974 not as an origin or beginning, but rather as a moment of recursive violence that connected it to many more distant histories of conflict in Cyprus, and beyond Cyprus, I should note. To the years of guerrilla warfare waged against British authorities as well as Turkish Cypriots by Greek Cypriot combatants, leading to the founding of the Republic in 1960, to the British ruling from 1898 to 1960, who introduced an ethno-national division between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots as a critical tactic of divide and rule, to the Ottomans ruling from 1571 to 1898, who governed the Christian and Muslim inhabitants of Cyprus as discrete and unequal religious communities, to the Venetians ruling from 1489 to 1571, who militarized the island and built its fortress geography, to the Lusignans, ruling from 1192 to 1489, who introduced feudal government, dispossessing indigenous residents, and concentrating massive estates in noble and foreign hands. To the Byzantines, ruling from 330 to 1191, who administered the growth of Orthodox Christianity throughout the island in bloody wars with European Catholic crusaders and Arab Muslim invaders. To the ancients, the Mycenaeans, Assyrians, Egyptians, Persians, Ionians, Hellenes, and Romans, the earliest inhabitants of this island of Aphrodite, and the earliest war makers, whose artifacts are still being excavated and celebrated in ethno-nationalist claims to the origins of Western civilization. How far back in historical time and through how many imperial formations of culture and political economy should the division of Cyprus be traced? This book is not about historical events in any case. It's about what it means to live in division and to live out its consequences, which continue to unfold today in the absence of any viable plan for reunification or definitive separation. My research took place almost 40 years after the war in 1974 in an emerging multivocal anti-nationalist community of scholars, activists, artists, educators, and journalists who were collaborating across ethno-national lines to produce knowledge and art about the forms and legacies of enduring conflict. I initiated this project in 2007 and continued in a sort of patchwork way for about 15 years. My longest period of research was a full year between 2011 and 2012 when I worked with the forensic teams of the Committee on Missing Persons, a bi-communal organization, so that means Greek-Cypriot and Turkish-Cypriot working together, convened by the United Nations, charged with locating and identifying the bodies of over 2,000 Cypriots who went missing during the violence of the 1960s and 70s. With the forensic teams, I worked on field excavations throughout Cyprus and in the laboratory in central Nicosia, the capital city, where remains were examined and identified. During that same period, I also involved myself in several organizations and institutes for public media that had recently been established in what's known as the dead zone or the buffer zone between the checkpoints in the center of Nicosia. And I attended dozens of documentary film screenings and exhibitions of art and archival photographs in Nicosia and other cities. In this way, I came to know a number of filmmakers and photographers whose work has been crucial to the development of a public visual vocabulary of conflict and peacemaking in Cyprus. And some of their work is showing here, and I'll get to the images in a bit. Artifacts are the special matter shared by the forensic scientists and artists whose knowledge-making I document in this book. They are material remains, exhumed or otherwise uncovered, examined, and made to reveal something about the past. Bones and archival images are the artifacts, in this sense, that anchored and molded the knowledge projects pursued by my interlocutors in Cyprus. But there's another sense of artifactual that I mean to get at as well, that of skillful works of knowledge. I chose the title Artifactual for this book, in part because I wanted to amplify the double entendre of fact, from the Latin factum, any number of sources tell me, I don't know Latin, meaning an act or fact, something both done and known. Art, or arte, accentuates the doing of the fact, the process of skillful crafting, the art of making facts. The forensic scientists and documentary artists whose work I examine often had specific and discrete goals that they could meet with the tools at hand to determine the singular identity of a set of human remains, to learn what had happened in a particular village on a particular day, to figure out who went where and when, to map the movement of people and things and money, to recover a memory or confirm the details of a story. But the tools they used to investigate and analyze the artifacts they handled were effective only insofar as they prepared those artifacts to link up with narratives about the past that were already at work in Cypriot public culture, shaping consensus reality or a collective sense of what counted as factual. On the unstable grounds of enduring conflict, consensus reality was especially hard to affirm or enlarge with such pieces of empirical knowledge. As a descriptor, then, artifactual conveys not only how knowledge is made, from what materials, with what tools, in what circumstances and timeframes, but also, and maybe more important, why knowledge is made, to what ends, in the service of which stories. In the context of long-enduring social division in Cyprus and the long-enduring coexistence of incompatible public narratives about a shared history of violence, the artifactuality of knowledge signals its special fragility and falsifiability. It describes an experience of time and interpretation of that experience, anchored by material objects that survived conflict and remain available for study, reuse, and recontextualization. In the book, I consider both the distinctiveness and the entanglement of forensic and documentary knowledge, highlighting moments when markers of one kind of knowledge appear in the context of another, for example, in the archaeological metaphors of time that pervade documentary films about the division, such as burying and digging the past, or the understanding of bones as pictures of the past that framed forensic analysis at the lab. These commonplace metaphors express special affinities between forensic and documentary investigation that I've tried to pinpoint and map in my own analysis. I also track the many ways in which documentary and forensic knowledge directly fed into and extended each other, as in documentary filmmaking about the forensic investigations, and the use of archival photographs by forensic teams to find clues to the location of hidden graves and the identity of missing persons. Part 1 of the book addresses the forensic investigations conducted by the Committee on Missing Persons. Investigative journalists on both sides of the division have shown that state authorities in the North and the South blocked the committee's investigations for decades, concealing information about the deaths of the missing and the location of their bodies, and either encouraging relatives to put the past behind them, most commonly in the North, or cynically nurturing the hope among relatives that their loved ones might still be alive in the South. In 2004, the recovery of the missing was separated from other issues relating to political settlement and newly framed as a non-political humanitarian project. So just as background, the Committee on Missing Persons was officially formed in 1981 and did not begin its investigations, or rather didn't begin its actually excavating until 2004. So during that entire period, the investigations weren't taking place. So since then, for 20 years now, the committee has been conducting investigations at a rapid pace. They operate with the controversial mandate not to attribute responsibility for the deaths of any missing persons or make findings as to the cause of such deaths. As critics have pointed out, this mandate is grounded in an ideology of closure, an expectation that confirming the deaths of the missing and returning their remains to families will suffice to heal the wounds of the past and clear a path toward reunification, thus naming the bodies of the missing, but not the perpetrators of their deaths. Reckoning with the remains of the missing then takes the public form of mourning rather than accounting. The concealment of evidence that could be used to seek justice for their deaths is a constitutive part of the investigation process, which involves the anonymization of witness testimony, the destruction of grave sites through excavation, and the storage of forensic photographs and findings in confidential archives. Despite this secrecy surrounding the precise fate of missing persons, the Committee on Missing Persons has received a great deal of media coverage in Cyprus in recent years, and the forensic teams have featured in a number of television broadcasts and documentary films. Images of scientists working with bones have grown commonplace in representations of Cypriot history, as pervasive as images of anguished relatives were in the immediate post-war years. Since then, too, forensic evidence has replaced grief as the public form of positive knowledge of violence, empirical evidence determining the fact of death. This evidence radically delimits what it means to know what happened, that is, to be certain of death without knowing its cause and circumstances. In exploring the material, social, and imaginary dimensions of these forensic investigations in Cyprus, I show how this process participates in an ideology of transparency that sometimes reproduces secrecy, suspicion, and impasse rather than resolving unanswered questions. In part 1 of the book, then, I pay special attention to the dynamic activity of the artifacts of death, the hard evidence of violence at the center of so much concealing and revealing and concealing again. The bones and belongings of the missing, exhumed painstakingly from mass graves, cleaned carefully and laid out on tables for analysis, identified and photographed, cataloged and archived before their reburial, are scripted in the narrative of healing and closure as the brute facts of death to be ascertained, and thus as substitutes for other truths that cannot be disclosed publicly. These artifacts objectify knowledge about the violence of the past that remains ever present in the ongoing division of people and places in Cyprus. In the book, I explore this process of objectification, that is, the transformation of suspicion into material objects and of those objects into objective proof. I examine the intimate and complex work that scientists do to see a missing person in their bones, a work of reconstruction, simulation, imagination, and humanization. And I consider what this knowledge does to the scientists in turn. In part 2 of the book, I consider how documentary filmmakers in Cyprus have been using footage and photographs of the events of the 1960s and 70s to experiment with the visual representation of Cypriot history. Archival material is flexible, available to viewers not only in the forensic register of evidence, but also in the phenomenological register of experience, of time, confusion, shock, reverberation. I show how Cypriot filmmakers have tapped into these different registers, presenting archival materials as transparent, uncontested evidence of the events in question, or as enhancements of the personal or collective memories of the events belonging to personae in the film, or as open-ended explorations or even poetic reveries of the events, without clear knowledge stakes or claims to historical truth. I trace the development of an aesthetics of the archive in Cypriot films, in debates over the terms of use and interpretation appropriate to archival material, and in the cultivation of a taste for archival material in documentary film. Notably, some Cypriot filmmakers have deferred the evidentiary problems of the archive, that is, what do archival images actually prove, seeking instead an edge to cut through convention in its phenomenological resources, reworking its resolution, speed, color palette, clarity, sequencing, in order to engage the sensorium of the audience, not so much to inform as to disturb and to imagine. What all these approaches share is a preoccupation with the material presence of the past. This preoccupation is linked to the complex operation of nonlinear time in Cypriot documentary films, in their visualization of artifacts like ruins and bones, but also in their incorporation of archival images to represent memories of war and memories of the time before war, family portraits, village scenes, wedding photographs, pastoral and urban landscapes. Perhaps more significant than these material visual imbrications in documentary films is their treatment of archival photographs and film as themselves artifacts, materials subject to decay and decomposition, materials that can be scratched and warped and otherwise altered by accident or design, and that in all these ways record and tell time and give intractably partial witness to what they show. In the book, I argue that when we consider archival images as artifacts in these ways, and visual archives themselves, we may better sense the resonances between forensic and documentary knowledge, which entails specific processes of destruction in the very practices by which knowledge is produced. In part one, as I noted a moment ago, I examined the destruction of knowledge through the anonymization and classification of witness testimony and other evidence about violent incidents, as well as the destruction of graves and of history and culture more generally, in the exhumation and recovery of the bones and belongings of the missing. In part two, I examined the destruction of history in the process of seeking and using archival material in documentary film. This process is a kind of repetition of the destruction of memory in the very formation of archives themselves through psychical repression and political suppression, as on Derrida's account in Archive Fever, or from a filmic vantage through the framing out and thereby the creation of what Barthes in Camera Lucida calls the blind field beyond the frame. Toward the end of the book, I explore the artifactual techniques employed by some Cypriot filmmakers to mine the creative potential in these processes of destruction. These techniques include blurring generic boundaries between documentary and fiction film, for example, by using archival material in fiction films or fictionalizing events from the archival record in documentary films. They also include deliberately altering archival material to draw attention to its mediation of memory, or faking archival material to emphasize how much archives do not tell us about the past. I understand these techniques as artifactual in the sense that they involve the reuse and recontextualization of objects that have survived from the past, artifacts, to engage viewers in an experience of moving in time that opens the question of their belonging to time. In this sense, archival images thematize temporality in the same way as the bones and belongings of the missing. But unlike those forensic artifacts, which can only be recognized or rejected, archival images are not defined by their singularity, nor burdened by their sanctity. And they're not destined to be reburied. They can be digitized and copied. They can be edited and doctored. They can be played with. I venture that in treating these images as artifacts, Cypriot filmmakers have found radical potential in the visual archive that bones do not offer, materials for imagining a different world to inhabit, not an altogether different world, but one made from the same past as the present one, with a future yet to be determined. With these thoughts about images and archives in mind, I incorporated a visual archive into the book in its art design. I compiled this archive from a number of sources: photographs from the Press and Information Office in the Republic of Cyprus, photographs from the Committee on Missing Persons, stills and screen grabs from documentary films and art performances, artworks by Nikos Philippou, Panikos Chrysanthou, and Alev Adil, my own photographs of places and events and people, and a few scans of fieldwork ephemera, as we call it sometimes. In the book, I was careful about sequencing these images, but not so careful about their placement in the text. You're getting a sense of the sequence here, even though this slideshow is just a selection of the images from the book. I wasn't so careful about the placement of images in the text because I didn't want the images to be read as mere illustrations of the text. They tell another story visually, a story about the mediation of time, memory, and knowledge by images. This mediation is an ongoing process of editing, framing, cutting, ordering, repressing, repeating, decaying, decontextualizing and recontextualizing, altering and repurposing. What I want to foreground by emplacing this series of images in the text is their meta-referential meaning, their common condition of being images that thematize images. If I've done it right, the sequencing of these images should generate reference to the production and selection and circulation of images over time, and thus to how these images have animated and shaped Cypriots and others reckoning with their history of conflict. In the end, I'm still asking, why do Cypriots want to know what happened so many years after the violence? What kind of knowledge do they seek? And is that knowledge effective? In my field work, a decade after the opening of checkpoints, opened the possibility of dialogue across division, I was tuning into conversations taking place all over Cyprus, in different locales and registers, conversations in which familiar places, people, and stories were reassembled from historical fragments and represented for collective recognition and inquiry. They were conversations about the good of knowing the history of conflict in Cyprus in two conflicting senses. In one sense, the good of knowing describes an ethical orientation, a valorization of truth as a prerequisite for recovery and reconciliation. The other sense, born of a more suspicious sensibility, takes the form of questioning. What is the good of knowing when knowledge itself is so fragile, partial, and debatable, when it carries the memory and the threat of harm, when it inexorably pulls people into conflicts they have not yet and might never overcome, or when it merely discloses again what everyone already knows? This tension within the good of knowing conditioned, I think, how people came to understand themselves as subjects of history 40 years after the war and counting. Artifactual is about the many ways in which they made knowledge and assimilated knowledge in that process of understanding, and the existential challenge posed to them by the indeterminate status of knowledge that cannot be shared. Thank you.
So I think, Chris, we can start with your questions, then I'll ask the students, and we'll do it this way. So let's have one from you, and then we'll try. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, I wanted to just commend the book and the writing. I've had to remind myself at multiple points that I was supposed to be taking notes and that it was an academic book. And in addition to the quality of writing, the quality of research, I recommended it to multiple people as a exemplar of ethnographic and interpretive methods to be used in the study of political science as well. So the question, the sort of leading question I have is that I concur with much of what you said about the difficulty in the locating this discrete starting and end point to what we would consider interpersonal violence in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, due in part because these acts of violence, much like Nico Sampson's coup, are products of structure and products of ideology. So sort of thinking of this project and this creation of knowledge as a form of justice, transitional justice, moving a society forward, demarcating a break with the past and delegitimizing a past ideology of violence, can knowledge production through these means, forensic and documentary, serve as a bottom-up way without judicial processes, without political influence of finding this sort of collective societal justice?
Small question. Thank you. So one thing to say at the outset is, and for people in the audience who don't know this history as well, the Committee on Missing Persons has been doing their forensic investigations in lieu of, in lieu of a transitional justice process. In other words, it's what's happening by way of producing knowledge about the events with the clear goal of avoiding a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So so this is part of the controversial mandate that I mentioned in my comments. It's something that, although I think the Committee on Missing Persons has quite widespread support in both the Republic and in the TRNC. There is quite a lot of criticism over the mandate itself. That is, that there won't be any findings of cause of death or circumstances of death, and that the knowledge that is being produced as part of the investigations can't really be recuperated in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Not that there's anyone being planned. The way that I heard people talk about this question when I asked them was, should there ever be a political settlement that would establish, establish something like, a sort of an overarching state for the sort of the bizonal plan. That it was possible, nobody that I knew thought it was likely, but it was possible that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission could be set up as part of that process. And I think that very much conditioned how the Committee on Missing Persons did its work. In other words, it was generating knowledge in a way that would make it very difficult for that information to be recuperated later. And it was part of the conditions of secrecy for the process itself. So with that said, I think, so I'm an ethnographer. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not an osteologist. I guess I am becoming a filmmaker. So, but my job as an ethnographer doing this kind of work was to, in a sense, apprentice myself to the people who were doing the expert knowledge production, to learn how they were doing it, to understand their frames of reference, the context in which they placed it, how they rendered meaning out of the work that they were doing. And I had many conversations with people, some of the forensic folks, many of the documentarians. I also work with journalists, teachers, other people who were, archivists, historians, people who were engaged actively in knowledge projects that touched on the 60s and 70s, but who were constantly asking themselves, what is the point of what I'm doing? Basically, everyone already knows what happened. It just can't be spoken publicly. It can't be politically operationalized. And so it's not as if there's an utterly secret history of what took place in the 1960s and 70s. The problem is that the political conditions don't exist today for that knowledge to become powerful, to be mobilized. And so I was often, even as I was trying to learn how other people were learning, one of the things I was learning is that people were questioning whether learning was a valuable enterprise. And so with that as a kind of general context for the work I was doing, I have to say that I guess I wrote this book partly with the mindset that not only was I not going to be introducing anything to the page that people didn't already know, questions that they weren't already asking, but also that my interlocutors who were engaged in these knowledge projects didn't necessarily see that the knowledge they were producing was going to advance a different kind of future. In other words, that it was going to become politically operational. So many of the, particularly with the artists that I worked with, they thought of their work as being quite interpersonal, that is, taking place on a small scale. One of the people whose images, there were a couple of stills from his films and then a couple of composed photographs by Panicos Chrysanthou, who's one of the best known documentary filmmakers in Cyprus, who's been working since the 80s, doing bi-communal work of all kinds. I attended, he had a sort of retrospective of his works in the winter of 2012. And in the gallery where the films were being shown, there was also an installation of photographs and stills from his film. And he would stay after the screenings, after the discussion and the Q&A, after one of his films was shown. There was a whole series that went on for a whole week. And he would stay after and just kind of hang out. And once in a while, somebody would come up to him and talk with him about one of the photographs, saying that they recognized where it took place, tell him a story about, you know, something that they remembered from there. And that's the level on which I felt like the photographic work that he was doing and the film work that he was doing was having an effect. It had a kind of efficacy that was partly poetic and partly political. You know, this was not something that I think he thought of as having being able to participate in anything like a cultural shift or an historical shift. Rather, it was much more targeted toward sort of reaching people in their own individual subjectivity, their relationship to memory, their relationship to the past, their thinking and orientation about the future. And you know, even with the Committee on Missing Persons, the forensic scientists clearly were making knowledge about the past. They were identifying remains. But I don't think most of them felt that they were doing something that was going to advance a political solution. They were encouraged, I think, by the administration of the committee and also by the broader, you know, by the broader culture, to think of the work they were doing as resolving individual traumas on the level of the family or the individual, rather than making some kind of change at the level of the political. So I don't know, is that a really long-winded way of saying no? Possibly. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
So I'll do a follow-up before we open it. I wanted you to talk a little bit about this artifactual timing or temporality that you mentioned as a way of countering the paranoid temporality that came with trying to reconstruct memory so that you hold on to that trauma as, in a sense, fixing the issue in the past and bringing the past as in a constant loop, as you had your photographs, being remembered by generations of people so that they remember that there is this trauma. And so I wanted to begin with that paranoid temporality, but commending you for coming with this artifactual temporality as a way towards reparation, where you bring in the fact that these images, if they are projected in a way that they're not coming with the attached knowledge that closes the image and fixes a meaning to them, then they become something that opens the possibility of a different type of future. And as we were talking last night, and I have probably students from my other class where today I was teaching the Eumenides. The Eumenides is the third play of the trilogy where actually you're talking about overcoming the trauma of war by not repeating blood feud cycles of violence, but coming in with a civil society that goes to law court, is the foundation myth of, you know, Supreme Court, is finding solutions in ancient Greece, obviously was the type of court justice. But what you posit here is that these images, these memories, instead of fixing them to a meaning that you can't overcome, you allow them to a different future, a more fluid kind of possibility or sea of possibilities that could open. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about that and have also our students think about events that we know are happening right now. You know, how do you overcome traumas that are repeated through this memory that is fed in so many different ways?
So it's a very complex question. And again, I want to say something at the outset. By the way, it's a giant caveat. I use the term, and it's not my term, but I use the term paranoid epistemology in the book as, and I'm borrowing this from a number of scholars and also thinking, of course, back to Freud and then, you know, all the way up to Eve Sedgwick, who talk about paranoia as a rigidity, a fixity, an obsessive attachment to replaying something, a trauma that one has been through, in order to try and master it without ever really being able to do that, because the conditions for redoing, for reliving differently a past trauma, the conditions have not arrived. And for Freud, that means psychic conditions. For Cedric, that means political, cultural, social conditions, political, economic conditions. So we're not talking about a clinical pathology. It's not a clinical pathology. It's an orientation to time. This is what Cedric says. The paranoia is an orientation to time, whereby you brace yourself for the future and any surprise that might come from the future by convincing yourself that the future will never be any different from the past. So there is no openness, good or bad. There's no openness in the sense that one's trying to reduce one's fear of the future that way, right? To protect yourself against something that might be traumatic, scary, mortifying. At the same time, one has no opening to seeing things differently. And so it has been remarked by a number of particularly Cypriot scholars and political scientists, anthropologists, that there is a kind of paranoid mindset in Cyprus. This is not me saying it, this is other people saying it. There's a kind of paranoid mindset which attaches people to the traumas that they or their parents or grandparents lived through, and a replaying of that as the very conditions of the present, such that a future that is different cannot emerge from the moment, from now. So that's not the story that I am telling about Cyprus, but it is a story that I'm reacting to in this book. And I think even though we live in this world, I still found myself and find myself wanting to develop a mindset for myself that allows me to see a future as being somewhat open and not just a rigid replaying of the past in precisely the same terms. And so it might be unwarranted optimism or hope on my part, or it might be that, I think I was hearing some of this from my interlocutors, and this is what I'm really trying to get at in the book, is that rather than thinking about the operation of time as paranoid in the sense of replaying a fixed past over and over and over again, never allowing a different future to emerge, that instead I'm trying to capture the recursivity of time. So that means that what people who are trying to learn in this case specifically, when people are trying to learn about what happened in the past, they're trying to educate themselves, they're trying to educate other people about the events and the experiences of the past. They have lots of material to work with. They can either assemble that material in the way that they already received it, in the official public narratives that circulate over and over and over again, or they can try to make the pieces move around a little bit. Can I put this story and this story together? Can I do a juxtaposition between two things and actually come to understand something that I didn't know before, or that wasn't part of the official public narrative before? It's still an orientation to the past, and that's the recursivity of it. Recursion is about doing an operation that has already been done and doing it over and over again, but by each time doing it a little bit differently, opening up a little bit of space to see if there might be a different path that could emerge, or just a different arrangement of facts, let's say, that might change a person's sensibility, might somehow unlock the rigidity of the past. So in the book, I'm really trying to explore what recursivity means with bones and with archival images. How are these artifacts from the past, how are they being recontextualized? Are they being recontextualized? Sometimes they're not. I don't want to tell an entirely optimistic story here about recursion versus paranoia. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes, I think in public culture there is a lot of, a sort of, not just in Cyprus, everywhere, a return to the past in the same received terms that one has always known it. But on the other hand, I think in some of the artist work that I was looking at certain moments in the forensic investigations that I witnessed, you know, and was taking part in, I felt like I was seeing people look at the past in a way that involved a little creativity on their part. And so we could even talk about, you know, kind of poetics of the forensic process, as well as the poetics of the archival process. And that's really what I was trying to capture with this kind of notion, this concept, this orientation of recursivity vis-a-vis paranoia, which is not to say that paranoia doesn't exist, but it's not the only thing that exists. There's what Cedric calls an ecology of knowledge. There are lots of different orientations to knowledge, and we do have some choice about which ones, you know, we celebrate and mobilize.
Thank you, Lisa. I wanted to ask, I'll just ask one student to read out his question. So that's Damien Wong. Okay. So let me bring you this. And then as people are thinking of their questions, can you pass it? I have another microphone as well in case somebody wants to ask a question.
All right, there we go. Hi, first of all, thanks for coming and speaking. And excuse me if I speak on anything out of term because I'm definitely not an expert in this subject, but my question was, in our class we've learned that knowledge is not fixed and depends on a larger discourse in which that knowledge is interpreted by an individual and meaning is created in this exchange. In your experience using forensic and documentary epistemologies and practices to try to stabilize the memory of Cyprus, how do you go about addressing people whose personal experiences, biases, stories from their parents/family members, etc., contradict the reality the artifacts suggest? And have you found success in changing the minds of people stuck in their own interpretation?
It's a great question.
Thank you.
And I didn't hear anything out of turn at all, on the contrary. So maybe I could say that there is a certain kind of privilege that I can claim as an ethnographer, that whatever knowledge I'm producing, it's secondhand, it's a little meta, and it's not probably, I mean, I don't know, we'll see if anybody in Cyprus reads this book, you know, and I end up getting into conversations with folks about it. But really, I feel like my job as an ethnographer was really to understand how other folks were working with their knowledge, you know, how they were learning to know in the specific ways that they were learning to know, and whether they were going through a process of learning, that is, actually developing an appreciation for, you know, a past that they hadn't recognized before, or the complexity of a past that they had once thought was rather simple, whether they in fact gained some kind of appreciation like that through the work that they did. I'll come to my own, you know, my own thinking later about that. But just to say that although, I mean, I would say that, especially in my work with the Committee on Missing Persons, the scientists, so those are the archaeologists and the osteologists, the people working in the lab and in the field, these were all people who had not even been alive when the war took place, okay? They were a younger generation of Cypriots. They had inherited certain narratives and also family memories and all kinds of stories, and also absorbed a kind of culture around, you know, how to think about the war and the division. But they weren't dealing with their own personal experience. And I actually witnessed a number of just discussions among people, you know, one day in the lab, for example, when there just wasn't much going on, you know, people getting into a sort of offhand conversation that led them into a whole discussion about the different sites of genocide across history and who did what and where, in a way that might, I mean, it suggested to me that there was a kind of loosening of the ethno-national terms of Turkish Cypriot vis-a-vis Greek Cypriot in that conversation that broadened out the horizons for thinking about what it means to be human, what war is, what genocide is. And so I felt like maybe particularly because these people were not reliving a trauma of their own, but rather were doing the work that they were doing in a sense on behalf of older generations of Cypriots who had lived through the violence, that maybe they were able to have a little bit more distance, but in any case, I definitely saw some people go through a process of developing a kind of appreciation for a past that seemed actually quite different to them, you know, through had come to seem quite different to them through the process of their work. Now that doesn't quite get to the problem of a person that you're, you know, hypothesizing, a person who's really tied to a particular memory or a particular story about something that happened in the 60s and 70s, which might be contradicted by other information that exists. This is a constant and relentless situation in Cyprus, I can say. It's part of why I wanted to try to write a book, you know, to try and sustain a tension among incompatible narratives without myself trying to resolve them and say, oh, well, this is really the true one. Because, I mean, I don't have the wherewithal to do that. I don't have the, you know, I don't have the expertise, and I certainly don't have the standing, right? What's at stake in these narratives is not at stake for me personally in the way that it is for my interlocutors. So, so what I was trying to do in the book is actually show, right, this sort of accumulation of contradictory stories, memories, positions, biases that, you know, don't ever cancel one another out, and put them all in one place, assemble them all in one frame. I think on a sort of micro scale, this is what the forensic scientists were going through on a daily basis. You know, they were either Turkish Cypriot or Greek Cypriot. By law, they had to be identified in ethno-national terms and balanced on teams. So they were either one or the other, and the remains that they were exhuming were one or the other. So they had to have an ethno-national relationship to the remains at all times. And they themselves, for the most part, from what I could see, were extremely good at sustaining a kind of a distance, I want to say, yeah, distance. I don't know. I saw people be very emotional, but there was a kind of, they were able to sustain ambiguity, right? Without having to make a certain claim, like I really know this or I really know this. Also, you know, bones only tell stories that people already know how to tell. So the bones weren't giving them any additional information except the identity of persons, not how they died. I have to say, the work that I did in Cyprus, I mean, sort of accidentally at first and then increasingly deliberately over time, I placed myself in a community of knowledge makers who were already deeply skeptical about the official narratives. So my own interlocutors were people who were already quite critical, who were already searching for themselves, for ways to liberate themselves from the ties of the past that they had grown up with, and were really eager to complicate their own narratives. So although I certainly encountered a number of people, many people, most people, I would say, that I encountered and got to know, and I'm still getting to know in Cyprus, were people who were, in a sense, reproducing official narratives. The community of interlocutors that I was working most closely with were people who were already doing this experimental work of trying on pasts that were different from the ones that had been storied to them. And that made it much easier for us to have these kinds of conversations, for me also to appreciate the poetic resonances of the work that they were doing, and to appreciate the skill, the deftness, and the thoughtfulness with which they sustain that kind of ambiguity. Now, they very often encountered critics, you know, and had to contend with politicians, journalists, other folks who were positioned in, you know, in public culture in such a way as to create scandals around the kind of knowledge that they were making. And, you know, the scientists at the Committee on Missing Persons, they were attacked constantly in the press, you know. Certain artists, Panikos, for example, has been in a kind of feud with the Ministry of Culture for 30 years. There are long-term relations of oppositionality that many of my interlocutors were engaged in. And so I think they may have felt embattled by the rigidity of the narratives about the past that they were trying to complicate. But, you know, as I said, I think on a small scale, interpersonally, sometimes they were able actually to be effective.
So let's have a couple of questions from the audience, and then I have one last one for you. So I think there is a question here, Tanya. Yeah.
Thank you for coming. My question was, what influenced you specifically to like follow missing persons from this conflict?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Sorry. I was wondering what influenced you specifically to follow missing persons from this conflict?
Yeah. I mean, once I had started spending time in Cyprus, it was a prominent public issue. I would have had to, had my eyes closed and my ears blocked not to pick up on the public significance of the Committee on Missing Persons. When I first went to Cyprus, it was only 3 years since the committee had started doing its investigations. They were in the press all the time. There was coverage of them on the news every night. So once I had figured out, for myself that Cyprus is a place I really wanted to spend a lot of time, for indefinitely. It wasn't actually that. I think it was something that I felt like it was a process that I could learn a lot from, and there was nothing arcane about it. As I said, it was publicly visible in all kinds of ways, and obviously already in 2007, the first time I went to Cyprus, already the subject of debate. As an ethnographer, this is the kind of thing that I pay attention to. What are people paying attention to in the locale? What do they care about? And so on a kind of basic level, I think that's one level of an answer. But I also, before I did this project, before I started doing research in Cyprus, I had worked in Greece for some time, and my first project was located in psychiatry clinics in the northeast of Greece, on the Turkish border, near the Turkish border. And my long-term experience in that neck of the woods introduced me to discourses around Ottoman history and the Turkish threat that themselves led me to think that Cyprus would be an interesting place to go, to kind of try to trace out the legacies that people on the Turkish border were speaking to. And it didn't, I write about this in the introduction to the book. My hunch that I would find answers to some of the questions that I started to have when I was working in Thrace, that I would find some answers to those questions in Cyprus, turned out not to be the case at all. Radically different contexts, the connections are not at all what I presume them to be. But I was already sensitized to the division of Cyprus as something that had enormous political relevance in contemporary Greece, where I had been working particularly right on the border, which was already militarized. It's much more militarized now for other reasons, but so I think sort of putting those orientations together, I started to think that the Committee on Missing Persons, if they would allow me to do research, would be, I would learn a lot. I would learn a very great deal from that process, and I certainly did. It's also, it's one of the things that ethnographers do, I think, sometimes. It's like, you've got to find a context in which to ask big questions. You can't just ask the questions. There has to be a framing. There has to be a delimitation. So I didn't want to just ask questions about the division and prospects of reconciliation. I wanted to think about how are particular people working these problems out in particular ways. That's how we can move between the big, more abstract questions and the very concrete, sometimes even practical, certainly, personal, smaller scale, through the practices of everyday life. And so I thought apprenticing myself to the scientists on the Committee on Missing Persons would be, would be very revealing, and it was. Yeah.
Liz, I wanted
Yeah.
to just pause and recognize, because that's you're modeling something we hope our students and we can do, which is you come in without preconceptions, ready to learn, to apply the tools, the skill set you bring, with respect, and kind of find and understand the people that create this knowledge. And as part of this learning, which is what you model constantly, I wanted to ask you to tell us something about the documentary filmmaking, because you actually created your own archive of photographs, of artifacts, and then now I have a number of students who are documentary filmmakers or filmmakers, and we were discussing how do you produce knowledge through a documentary. So now you have been exploring it, trying to understand how documentaries are made or kept, and now you're making your own. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, so thinking of making a documentary as knowledge producing, that framing already feels a little daunting to me. So, but you're absolutely right. So, just a few quick words about the film itself. I'm working with a Cypriot media maker, photojournalist, David Hans, who's a partner in this project. And we are tying together three strains, or three stories, I guess I would say, about the public, political, and cultural significance of human remains, but not just any human remains, sacred remains. So the relics of St. Lazarus, which are, according to the church, kept at the church of in Larnaca, and are processed every year, a little bit over a week before Easter every year, to massive crowds. So there's the story of St. Lazarus. There's the story, which is actually the subject of my second book about Cyprus, Tassos Papadopoulos, he's past former president of the Republic of Cyprus, who served as president from 2003 to 2008, but had been in every way that you can imagine involved in the political life of the Republic since even before independence, who's a towering figure, let's say, in recent and modern Cypriot history. When I was in Cyprus, the first summer I was in Cyprus, I came to understand through news broadcasts that his remains had been stolen from his grave a year after his death. And I started paying attention to that story, and then I started researching that story, and then I started collecting images and media material, and ended up using that story as a kind of case study for thinking about conspiracy theory in Cyprus and well beyond Cyprus. And so in the film, the story of what happened with that president's body that's one of the main strands. The story of St. Lazarus is one of the main strands, and then there's also what happened with Archbishop Makarios, the first president of Cyprus. I won't get into details, but just to say, after his death, a very important body part of his also had a different itinerary from the rest of his remains. And so what we're doing this film, and it's in process, and it's a process that feels very different to me from an ethnographic research project. So I'm learning also from the doing of film, which is quite different from the learning about how others do film. We're trying to work with mostly found materials, so mostly archival photographs, as well as in the story of St. Lazarus. There's quite a bit of filming that we're doing of the relics themselves and the way that they are revered ritually. And trying to tell a story without explaining too much, maybe with no words at all, beyond whatever is ambient in the, whatever's, occurs in the material itself, to tell a story about the significance of bodies that are politically significant and religiously significant. So to tell a story about the relations, the complex relations between religion and politics in the Republic of Cyprus through the death and afterlife of particular bodies. And if there is knowledge to be made in this process, it will come, I think, from the juxtaposition of the three stories. That is, our placing them all within the same frame, literally and otherwise, to help generate a sense of connection among them. I can tell you that I with maybe one exception, as I've talked to many people over the years of working on this project, nobody but me has made a connection between Lazarus and Tassos Papadopoulos. But that is the possible increment of knowledge that might arise from the juxtaposition of these stories. The connection that I see and that my collaborator sees among these bodies has to be shown in order to be known. And I think that's we're not making very much original material. We're using material that already exists. And again, it's a recontextualization project. So what do we learn from the recontextualization of stories we already know? Well, that's I hope the knowledge that will come out of it.
Thank you, Lisa. I wanted to end by having us read a poem. So I'll start, it's on here. It's called All Bread. And Chris, you'll read the first slide. I'll read the second.
Vacate the stage.
and I started this process when I was chairing the college council, and we had conflict the year before. So I didn't know how to start the invocation of a college council when there is...
All bread is made of wood, cow dung packed in brown moss, the bodies of dead animals, the teeth and backbones, what is left. After the ravens, this dirt flows through the stems into the grain, into the arms, 9 strokes of the axe, skin from a tree, good water, which is the first gift, 4 hours.
Live burial under a moist cloth, a silver dish, the row of white famine bellies swollen and taut in the oven, lungfuls of warm breath stopped in the heat from an old sun. Good bread has the salt taste of your hands after 9 strokes of the axe, the salt taste of your mouth. It smells of its own small death, of the deaths before and after.
Lift these ashes into your mouth, your blood. To know what you devour is to consecrate it, almost. All bread must be broken so it can be shared. Together we eat this earth.
Thank you, guys.